Hello and welcome to Kia e-Niro Diaries Encore and a Happy New Year to you. I'd like to thank all those who've been watching and subscribing as we continue the sort of long-term ownership experience of the car. So 2022 was the third full year owning the e-Niro. It's going to be 4 years in March since I took delivery of the car. And what I did through the year was made a note of what the state of charge was when I plugged in and what the state of charge was when I unplugged. Now, it may seem a bit tedious and a bit stato, but I just thought it would be interesting to look at the sort of charging cycles and look at the bands over which we charge, because sometimes you plug in for a few minutes when you're at the supermarket and it's a very narrow charging band, and other times you're quite low on charge, you charge higher, or on occasions up to 100%. So in this video, I'm going to go through how many kilometers we drove in the year, how many times we plugged in, how many times we plugged into public chargers as opposed to charging at home, what the average starting state of charge was and the average finishing state of charge, and also looking at the medians of those, because obviously some of those numbers get skewed by these very short, of what I call grazing, power grazing at supermarket. Anyway, so you won't have to look at my ugly mug all through this, because we're going to be showing you some of just driving around the local area while I give you all the stats. So here we go then. During 2022, which was the third full year that we've owned the car. It's nearly 4 years old. It's going to be 4 years old in March. Well, 4 years since we took delivery of it. So during 2022, we covered 19,913 kilometres, which is 12,346 miles. And we plugged in 114 times, which means that the average distance that we gained every time we plugged in was 174 kilometres. We went to 100% charge on 17 out of 114 occasions, and the lowest starting point for charging was 7%. Now, I plug in mostly at home, and we plugged in 68 times out of 114 times at home. We plugged in 46 times to public chargers, and that was split between 25 DC chargers and 21 AC chargers. Now, 11 of those AC chargers were at supermarkets where we did what we call micro charging. So you go to the supermarket, you get 5 or 6%, maybe 4, 5%. And so the range of the charge there is very small, but they've started to charge for charging now at our Lidl, so we don't use it anymore. There's no point. We also plugged in 4 times at hotels and got free charging. And in fact, during the year, I worked out that we got the equivalent of 4 and a bit full charges just for free, mostly at hotels. And we were also quite lucky with a couple of DC charges. We got 1, 2, 3 free DC charges on our travels, and it all added up to, I reckon, 263 kilowatt hours of free, which is pretty good. And using the average efficiency of the car, which is about 14.3, 14.4 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres, we got about 3,800 kilometres free. So during the year, we got just over 19% of all our kilometres covered from free charging, which has got to be good. So just under 60% of all our charging was done at home. In terms of the number of times we plug in, it's not necessarily the same as the amount of power we actually put into the car. But in fact, most of the power we put in the car was at home, because when we plug in at home, we tend to plug in for a long time. It's overnight, it's charging slowly. On average, the state of charge that we started charging at was 41%, and the average state of charge where I unplugged was 76%. But of course, that is not really telling the whole picture, because averages are then skewed by plugging in for 4 or 5% micro charges at supermarkets, which I don't think we'll be doing so much of this year. So what I did was look at the median. So it's, obviously frequency distribution, little bit of math just about within my capabilities if I use Excel. And our median starting state of charge was 38%, and our median ending state of charge was 80%. And in fact, most of the times I plug in at home, we finish the plug-in at 80%, and very occasionally we're supposed to do it once a month, really, according to the manual, but we take it to 100%, even if we don't need 100% for a longer journey. So the typical charging range between starting to charge and ending the charge is about 40%. And I think that's quite significant, because if you look at some of the stats on websites like batteryuniversity.com, what they say is that a nickel manganese cobalt battery, or as some people call them, ternary battery, like you have in the e-Niro, should really be able to withstand 1,500 full charges and discharges before you see a more than 20% degradation on the battery. But of course, that is assuming that you take the battery very, very low state of charge and you charge it to 100% every time. Most people don't do that. We certainly don't do that. The charging range is much narrower, and in fact, if again look into the stats, the narrower the charging range, the more cycles you can in fact do before you see a degradation of where you get below 80% of the original range of the car. Now, there are some people on YouTube who are going, lithium ion phosphate batteries are the way to go. They can be charged to 100% over and over. They don't care, and they can do 2,000-3,000 cycles before you see serious degradation. But to be honest, if you do the maths on that, you're talking about a car that would be able to do enough cycles to provide like 30 to 40 years of motoring for the average driver. And, an NMC battery, I think it's a technology that will be surpassed. I think the future cars like the e-Niro and the Hyundai Kona, sort of mid-price sort of cars, they're going to be using lithium iron phosphate because it's cheaper and they are safer. They are less prone to catching fire. And so I think this car, say we took delivery of it in March 2019, we're average mileage, actually slightly over average, probably because we're a one-car household, doing about 20,000 kilometres, 12,000 a year. So even if we did charge to 100% every time and discharge to a low point every time, 1,500 charges a year, what is it? We did 114 plugins this year. But of course, if we'd have fully charged and fully discharged, we wouldn't have done so many plugins. But, every time you get at least 400 kilometers of range. So, 1,500 cycles at 400 kilometers range is, what's that? It's like, I don't know, 400,000 to 600,000 kilometers, which is, who cares? Basically, I'm just never going to live that long to drive that far. So, in terms of looking at the life of the battery, I really think that, we're using up every time you plug in, you use up some of your cycle times. But when you're charging in such a narrow range, if you, again, look at batteryuniversity.com, when you go to like 20 to 80%, on an NMC battery, you're looking at like 2,500 to 3,000 cycles. And if you do sort of 30 to 70%, you're looking at 3,500 to 4,000 cycles. And again, do the maths, and you're looking at a battery that should last 400,000 or 500,000 kilometers, 250,000, 300,000 miles before you see serious degradation of the battery. And I think, to be honest, that a bigger factor is just going to be calendar aging, where, like everything, it gets old. And I would expect that when this car is 10 years old, if I'm still driving it, it would have done 200,000 kilometres, 120,000 miles. I may start to be seeing some battery degradation, not because of the number of times I've plugged it in, but because it's just getting a bit old. And maybe by 15 years old, the range could be down to about 350 kilometres, but still a useful car. And who knows? We don't really know yet how these things are going to age. Obviously, we've got quite a few examples out there now of people at the kind of far end of the bell curve, like taxi drivers and courtesy cars, where they get driven hard all the time, charged to 100% a lot. There are some Teslas out there that have done 500, 600, 700,000 miles. And I think there are some quite high mileage Nissan Leafs and e-Niros and Hyundais too. And they're not really showing any sign of degradation. But of course, it's the years that are going to take the toll as well as the cycles. Anyway, just to finish off, in terms of costs last year, to cover the distance we did, 19,900 and something kilometres, we spent €352 on public charging. And because of the solar panels on my roof, all the charging I did at home is effectively free, because we generated 2,600 kilowatt hours from the solar last year, which, if I net that against the plugins we did at home, it more than covers what we did based on the average efficiency of the car. Anyway, hope you found that interesting. I think 2023 is going to be another amazing year for electric cars. We're going to see, last year I think it was 1 in 5 new car sales in Europe were electric. This year it's going to be more like 1 in 4. And the availability of batteries is going to increase as more and more factories come online. And all these naysayers and, electric cars are a scam and all of this stuff, they're just sort of fighting against the inevitable, because we all want to see less fossil fuel cars on our roads, polluting up the place. We want to see the oil industry start to go downhill. And, by the end of this year, there'll be about 30 million EVs on the world's roads. And that's working it out that there are about 1.4 billion private cars and vans on the world's roads today, using 40 million barrels of oil a day. If you work it out, then by the end of this year, electric cars will be taking about 1 million barrels of oil a day out of demand. It's only a start, but it's the beginning of the end of oil as a transportation fuel. It's going to take 20 years, but eventually we're going to get there. By the end of this decade, probably, 250 million electric cars on the world's roads. And that's going to be taking 4 to 5 million barrels a day out of demand. So it'll look very much like it did during the COVID times, when driving was very much curtailed, as was flying, and the demand for oil went right down. And dealers were actually unable to sell crude oil that was in transit on the high seas, and it had a negative price for a few days. Just think about that. So, the oil industry is so finely tuned that a small drop in demand for its products kills the price overnight. And we are heading towards that with the growth of electric cars and now trucks, with Tesla now rolling out the Semi, and Mercedes and Renault and a few others, starting to see a few 20-tonners and smaller, these big trucks starting to use electricity rather than fuel, diesel fuel. Anyway, hope you found that interesting and you have a great year. And until the next time.